This is a conversation with Iain McGilchrist. Hi, Iain.
Hello, hi.
So, Iain, you have given a lot of thought to what it's like to be human.
Yes, my career took me around a number of different interesting areas from that point of view. I originally went to Oxford to study philosophy and theology, but I ended up studying English literature, which, of course, is in many ways the study of human beings, their minds and their feelings, and ended up studying medicine and becoming a psychiatrist with an interest in neuroscience, which is another way of looking at human beings and their feelings and their communication. And I suppose they could be considered fairly contrasting. I certainly have found it interesting, the different cultures in the humanities and in the sciences, and I think it's been a great help to me that I didn't even begin to study medicine until I was about 30, and had already a background in philosophy and literature. In fact, one of the things that led me to medicine was a dissatisfaction with a certain way of thinking about ourselves and art. In fact, art, of course, is not very unlike human beings. Artworks are more actually like people than they're like things, a point which Aristotle first made. But of course, in academe, one starts taking an analytic approach to, say, a poem, and is then surprised to find that it doesn't yield anything very like what it was that moved you or seemed important to you in the first place. And one of the difficulties I thought there was that people thought of poems as rather disembodied, and as though they affected us as disembodied brains and consciousnesses interested in ideas principally, whereas it seems to me that a poem or any work of art, a piece of music or a sculpture or whatever, a painting, is an embodied, incarnate thing which can't be paraphrased or turned into something virtual. It just actually is exactly what it is and nothing else, and that it has an effect on us as embodied beings. So embodiment as an important part of what a human being is was really the key thing in my study of the arts that made me want to study medicine.
So a sense of, in a way, strangely enough, that studying the arts led to a way of focusing on the arts in a way that deprived them of what it is that give them their vibrancy and their aliveness, and turning them into disembodied stuff.
Yes. There's a great English poet called Ted Hughes who studied English at Cambridge, and he after 2 years, he had a dream in which a fox came to him in the night. It came into his room and put its bloody, charred paw on his essay that he was writing and said, "Why are you killing us?" And I had a sort of similar feeling about this, and wrote a book, in fact, called Against Criticism, which was about what the problem with that was. And as I say, it seemed to me to have something to do with turning something that was unique in the incarnate and entirely individual into something general and abstract. And that led me to look at the mind-body problem. And the trouble was that philosophers were all too disembodied in their approach. And I thought the thing to do is to go and look at this from a more embodied point of view, which of course meant studying medicine and seeing near to first hand as one can what happens when something goes wrong with somebody's brain or their body and it affects their mind, or something goes wrong with their mind and it affects their body. So that is how I ended up being a psychiatrist.
So obviously we have right there the terms of what you later explore of that disembodied thing, that idea of two ways of looking at things, the cutting down into little parts or looking at the whole. That's a big theme.
Yes, it is. Yes, in a way, the theme of my work has always been anti-reductionist. I've always been puzzled all my life by the notion that things were mere this or just that or only anything else, and that is indeed a procedure that one is right to be suspicious of. As Wittgenstein responded, remarking, nothing can ever be reduced to anything other than what it is. So, and indeed, what intrigued me was that in writing about literature, I was constantly fighting with language, because in trying to make explicit the problem, language was always leading me back to everyday meanings, whereas I was trying to get beyond them to something that our language doesn't normally seem to encompass. And I was sitting one day in college at lunch with a colleague who was a great sinologist, and he said, "Oh, I understand what you mean. The concepts you're striving for exist in Chinese, but they don't exist in English." I thought that was very interesting, and I started to study in a very amateurish way Oriental literature, and was relieved to find that, yes, indeed, these concepts did exist there. And then when I got to the Maudsley Hospital and the Institute of Psychiatry in London, where I was working, I was very fortunate to come across the work of a colleague, John Cutting, who'd just written a famous classic book now called The Right Cerebral Hemisphere and Psychiatric Disorders, and I thought I'd go and hear him talk. And I was completely amazed by what I heard him say, because in medical school we'd heard virtually nothing about the right hemisphere. It was said to be a bit vague and not very intelligent, and it sort of was interested mainly in sort of fluffy artistic things, but really all the sort of heavy intellectual stuff was done by the left hemisphere. And he was saying something very much more subtle. He'd spent most of his professional life carefully attending to what happens to people who have something wrong with their right hemisphere, say a stroke or a tumor or something that disables part of their right hemisphere, and noticing what actually happens to their experience of the world and of human beings. And it was fascinating, because this related very much to the issues I'd had about the way in which we criticize analytically a work of literature, because he was saying, although the left hemisphere can understand literal meanings, it can't understand implicit meaning. It doesn't understand metaphor, tone of voice, inflection of the voice, the expressions in the face, body language. All this indirect expression is appreciated mainly by the right hemisphere. So is interested in the unique and the particular rather than the generic and the abstract. It has more rich associations with the limbic system and with the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which regulates our autonomic reactions to experience. And so I was thinking, my God, here's half of the brain that we've been writing off, which is actually fundamental to what it is to be a human being. And indeed, I later learned a fascinating truth that most people are unaware of, that it is easier to rehabilitate a person who's had a left hemisphere stroke, even though it means that they're going to usually have problems speaking and problems using their right hand. It's easier to rehabilitate them than it is to rehabilitate somebody who's had a right hemisphere stroke, because such people just don't understand the world. They don't understand what's being said, and they completely lack insight into their incapacities. They're, as it were, blind to them. And that element of denial is another very important difference between the hemispheres.
So I want to just, summarize a little bit what I heard as a sense of, you started talking about noticing two ways of thinking, and interested in embodiment, and in this you find an embodiment of how these two ways of thinking correspond to the two hemispheres, and in a way, even though the right hemisphere is one that in our culture we pay less attention to, it is in many ways a primary source of how we function effectively, because this is how we grasp a situation as a whole, as opposed to, in a way, the details of it.
That's absolutely right. I mean, the only thing I would change there is that I think you're dead right to talk about two ways of thinking in one sense, because it's certainly not about thinking versus feeling. It's about an unsophisticated mechanical way of thinking versus a much more complex, a dynamic way of thinking. In fact, it's a sort of dialectical way of thinking that we find in the philosophy of Hegel and his contemporaries. So it is about two ways of thinking, but more than that, it's about two ways of being in the world, if one can use that expression.
Mm-hmm.
It's about thinking or feeling or any of these things primarily. It's about a whole disposition of the human being towards other beings and towards the world at large.
Mm-hmm. So two ways of being in relationship with the world, and not just in relationship in a passive way, but understanding
right.
the world and interacting with the world.
In fact, one of the differences is that the right hemisphere understands that there are these constant, complex, reverberative interactions, whereas the left hemisphere tends to see linear, systematic ways of thinking, such as, I push object A, which hits object B, and so forth. So it has a sort of Newtonian idea about how we interact with the world, whereas the right hemisphere way of thinking would, if you want to carry on the simile from physics, would be more in keeping with the sort of Copenhagen-like interpretation of the material world.
Yeah. So something that's going to be more complex.
Complex, yes, and less certain. This is very important. The left hemisphere, I believe, has evolved in order to enable us to have quick, precise interactions which enable us to feed and manipulate things. In other words, to catch prey, pick up a seed, pick up a twig to build a nest, grasp hold of something and build. So in order to do manipulative interactions with the world, we need a sort of precision. But in fact, that precision is illusory. It doesn't actually exist. Nothing is as clear or black and white as the left hemisphere likes to see it. And it's the right hemisphere that's much more at home with things that are only partially expressed, which are perhaps contradictory in nature, because after all, often a thing and its opposite may coexist and be equally true, an idea that the left hemisphere struggles with, that the right hemisphere is at home with.
So in a way, it's
very important in dealing with patients and with the human psyche, not to get into this idea that I'm sure all your listeners will be familiar with, of sort of cutting off the things that don't cohere with the rather simple idea we have of ourselves, and not, in fact, integrating things that may at first glance seem unwelcome into one's idea of oneself and of others.
Yeah. So a sense of being able to get a sense of the situation as a whole.
Absolutely, yes. I mean, we believe, because when we think about it consciously, we think we must have construed the world by understanding one little bit and another and putting them together. But in fact, there are easy ways to demonstrate that can't in fact be the case. We have a shot at the whole, and we refine that first shot by further feedback, if you like, from the environment. But we see it whole, and then are guided to look at certain areas of interest in detail later. But in our attempt to understand what's going on, when we reflect on it, we use left hemisphere ways, and we think we built it up from pieces, which is just not the case.
Yeah. So as I listen to you express this, part of the question is, of course, in a way, how does this apply to what we do? But I would like to maybe put the question not so much in terms of professional life and patients, but even in a personal life. Certainly for me, the way I relate to this is a sense that it's a validation of that part of me that is more intuitive, or that wants to have a feel of a situation, have a sense of it, versus, say, the criticism that the only way to apprehend truth and reality is to have that linear logic.
Yes, one of the things that I hope would be an outcome of my book is to help people to understand that it's only one half of one's brain, the left hemisphere, and indeed the half that literally sees less, and understands less. It's only according to the left hemisphere that there is a truth which is achieved by that kind of logical analysis. There is, of course, value to such analysis. I'm not in the business of trying to discredit either the ideas of clarity or rational thinking. They're extraordinarily important. But they aren't ultimately the way of arriving at the truth. They're helpful servants. They're not good masters. And I think my message is that the right hemisphere is both the one that grounds our experience and the one that ultimately helps us make sense of it. It sends things off, if you like, to the left hemisphere for intermediary processing, which can be very useful. It unpacks the implicit and helps us see more of what's there. But the left hemisphere on its own can't understand things. It can't relate them to the whole picture. For that, one needs the right hemisphere. And as you know, it's the thesis that I unfold in the second part of my book. The book's in two halves. The first part on neuropsychology and philosophy, really, and the second part, a history of our culture, looking at the main movements in the history of ideas through the lens of what we've learnt about ourselves through this differentiation between the left and the right hemispheres. It's my contention that in the current age we rely much too much on left hemisphere forms of analysis only, and that is dangerous, because one only sees part of the truth and one is not aware of the things that one is not seeing. In other words, there are unknown unknowns that are very important. And if we were more willing to open ourselves to the right hemisphere's way of understanding things and to be less dogmatic and less certain about the things that our left hemisphere tells us, we'd be wiser human beings.
Yeah. So we're not talking about shifting from one to the other, but we're talking about expanding and living more with that understanding that comes from the right hemisphere and interacting with that perspective.
That's right. It's not about preferring and somehow disapproving the left hemisphere. The only thing to disapprove of in the left hemisphere is when it thinks it knows everything. And so it's about partnership. We need both hemispheres. We need to be able to use them both flexibly. And people who are able to do this are people who are best able to understand life and to make wise judgments. This used to be thought of as the aim of education, and the ultimate goal of the human being was to get what was known as reason or judgment, which was not mere rationality. It wasn't a kind of mechanical reasoning of the kind that a computer does. It was more like what Aristotle calls phronesis, which is a kind of wise blending of one's capacity to reason with the fruits of experience. And I'm afraid that part, the fruits of experience, is consistently undermined in the way we approach the world nowadays. We think we can account for everything using algorithms, but actually we can't.
Right. That's the algorithm is only reflecting how much the basis of experience is.
Yes. Again, it's a rough and ready sort of tool that works well at a sort of intermediary level, but it will not allow one to get beyond it. The difficulty with this kind of thinking is that it allows one to be very mediocre, but it doesn't allow one to get beyond that. So the drive always to operationalize everything from the interaction between the therapist and the patient to the way a judge makes a judgment in a case. The tendency to try and give what are called guidelines and are really, in fact, tramlines is not helpful. It's all going to be about the individual therapist with that individual patient, and it's going to be about an interaction, which is a relationship, the important thing there, rather than the gathering of information or the imparting of information. That of course, goes on as a sort of secondary activity, but it's not the core of what happens.
Right.
And it's not the core of what happens in any sophisticated area of life. For a teacher, for a doctor, for a lawyer, for or for that matter, for a librarian or a potter or a social worker or whoever. So we all need to be re-sophisticating our idea of what a human being is and what the world on which we live is. It's not just a heap of resource for us to exploit.
So in other words, one way to apply this to our work in professional work in psychotherapy is not to think of it in terms of recipes or methods or approaches that would come from it, but a sense of putting our focus and appreciation on the process, on what happens as a result of the very specific interaction that we have between therapist and client, and looking at it in terms of what the implicit process that's there.
Yes, I don't decry all models, of course. They're useful tools. Once again, they're useful at the sort of middle level. The simplest way of explaining this is by analogy with a performing musician. One is first attracted to a piece and wants to play it because of the whole thing and one's relationship with it. But if one's going to play it, one then needs to spend many hours in analysis or taking it apart, practicing this little passage over and over again, looking at the enharmonic shifts and so forth. And all that is terribly useful. But at the end of the day, when you come to perform, you've got to have that all completely out of your mind. Otherwise, you'll give an absolutely frightful performance. And the same is true of mutatis mutandis of many, many areas of life, including the area of therapy. It's useful to have a repertoire of techniques at one's fingertips that one has acquaintance with and one has at times practiced. But one needs to be much more flexible, alert, intuitive, receptive when one's actually in the business of the consulting room.
So we get to essentially Zen and the art of archery.
Yes, it's very like that, I think. But I mean, all this is there in Oriental wisdom. What I've tried to do in my book is show by looking the other way in huge technical detail at the brain what science can tell us, which is actually very much the same message, I think. And it's interesting to me also that the process of philosophy in our time, philosophy is often thought of as an analytic process, and for some philosophers that's all it ever is. But of course, that can lead to certain perceptions, but that increasingly philosophers have come to the conclusion that leads to a dead end. And most of the great philosophers of the last 100 years, despite being trained in that method, have ended up saying, at the end of their lives, really, that poetry is more helpful than analytic philosophy. I mean, that was certainly a conclusion of Heidegger. It was also the conclusion of Wittgenstein's. And one can see this process in others, in Hegel and Schopenhauer and in Nietzsche. So some of our Western philosophers and much of the tradition of Taoism and of Zen come together in this, and come together, interestingly, with modern physics and, I would say, with the findings of neuroscience. The trouble is that purity in biology, we're a bit lagging behind, I would say, in the general culture of the life sciences. In the non-life sciences, such as physics, they gave up on a mechanical dead universe a very long time ago. But curiously, in the so-called life sciences, a lot of people practice a way of thinking which is reductionist and mechanistic. It's a bit of a paradox, that, really.
It is, and at the same time, it is strange to see how, for instance, if people, when you go to a hematologist and they study the blood actually doesn't exist in and of itself, but it's everything else that's happening in the body.
Well, yes, and, when one talks about the brain, one ought to sort of mention that, when one uses the word brain, one's actually dealing with probably the brain and the body together, because much of what the brain is dealing with is also going on in the heart and the gut and so on. So, yes, we and our memories and our consciousness are no doubt not confined just to the brain.
Mm-hmm. So, as we come to the end of this conversation, is there something that you would want to say to conclude? Well,
I suppose there's a parallel people often say to me, so what are we to do about it, in a kind of anxious way. And I think that's not a very helpful approach. I think it's the way we get ourselves into all kinds of messes, because then experts pop up saying the 8 things we need to do to save the planet are. And this is really just a way of satisfying the left hemisphere, which is not really listening to the full story and seeing that it's about a completely different view. But how can I hang on to the current paradigm, and by sticking a plaster on here, the plaster and make it work? As a therapist and as a doctor, and speaking to colleagues, I would say we all know that it's no good telling people. You may be able to see it the very first time you meet them. There are certain things that's very important for them to stop doing, and certain things that would be obvious if they started doing. It's no good telling them that. You're in the business of raising awareness, and only when they get to see the things that you can see, then they will start to change. So I'm in the business of raising awareness, and so what I would say is, I'm here to encourage people. And if they want to read more about it, to have a glance at my book. But the thesis of it essentially is that we are being sold a very reduced version of ourselves and the world, and that this is not the most sophisticated or intelligent way of thinking about the world. Quite the opposite. It is, in fact, a fiction, an illusory fiction, that is bred by a part of the brain that's mainly interested in grabbing things. And nothing against grabbing things. We all need to get food and build houses, and indeed we wouldn't have a civilization without it. But it's only part of the story. And the thing I like is the phrase that I picked up only after I'd written the book, but I discovered that Einstein said that whereas reason is a faithful servant, intuition is a precious gift, and that we live in a world that has lauded the master, the servant, but has forgotten the gift. And I think that's the world we're now sadly inhabiting.
So really, essentially, it's turning established wisdom on its head, and talking about the idea that actually, which one is the servant and which one is the master, and you can actually expand your world by paying attention to that other way of interacting with the world.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Thanks, Iain.
Well, thank you very much, Serge.
This recording is part of the podcast at relationalimplicit.com.
But I discovered that Einstein said that whereas reason is a faithful servant, intuition is a precious gift, and that we live in a world that has lauded the master, the servant, but has forgotten the gift. And I think that's the world we're now sadly inhabiting.
So really, essentially, it's turning established wisdom on its head, and talking about the idea that actually, which one is the servant and which one is the master, and you can actually expand your world by paying attention to that other way of interacting with the world.
Yes, indeed. Yes.
Thanks, Iain.
Well, thank you very much, Serge.
This recording is part of the Proactive Mindfulness podcast. We explore how to be more present and engaged in our lives and how to make lasting change. This is a contemporary take on mindfulness, informed by embodied therapy and the polyvagal theory. You can find more articles and videos on the website proactivemindfulness.com.